you had a podcast about whiteness, and the opening question that you would always ask is, what is whiteness? And so I want to play the Uno reverse back to you card.
Oh,
what
wow.
is whiteness?
I mean, let me talk over all of my guests. Maybe I'll answer it this way and say, look, obviously different guests answered it differently. There were even some guests who refused to define it.
Really?
Yeah, which I thought was really interesting. I think of whiteness as being a structure of domination that essentially structures our society in a way that creates a hierarchy of human value, and that value places white people at the top of it, and even within white people there are hierarchies, and it's what people of color come up against at every turn. So it's both invisible but deeply structuring and powerful of people's everyday realities. And I had my own kind of experience of, quote unquote, going through the looking glass of whiteness when...
If you weren't Muslim, I'd call it a come to Jesus moment. A come to Isa moment.
Yes.
It was a come to Isa moment.
Yes, both. Yes to both. I obviously wore hijab for most of my adult life. I was racialized by white people as other, which is going to be hilarious to people watching this who are like, are you telling me that white people looked at you and were like, you're not white? And the answer to that is yes. I was called the P word. I was called a sand N. I was called all kinds of racial slurs on a regular basis when I wore hijab, and I would experience very similar things that, racialized communities experience. And of course, with the caveat that different racialized communities experience that more or less. And I would say that, to be absolutely clear on this, people racialized as Black experience the hardest brunt of that in every single culture.
I mean, it's one of the things that, I cannot say this enough to people, is that when you go out with a group of friends and you've got one or two Black people, right? That's one thing. When I've gone out with groups who are majority Black and I see how that majority Black group of people is being treated.
Thank you.
Sometimes it's like you've gone through a door into the Twilight Zone, and, it's not as if this is my first racism rodeo, right? But the intensity of it.
Absolutely. And that's now. Else. And that's now. We're talking about now, right?
Yeah.
Because for me, I would say now, I observe it in exactly the settings you've just described. And that's when my inner Karen goes wild, because I'm just like, I'm sorry, is this how you treat all your customers, or is it just the Black ones? Because, where this is ignite the Karen on steroids. When I'm in a situation where I know for a fact I would not be treated like that. I would not be treated like that. I feel very, I feel like it's a moral responsibility in that setting to wield my whiteness in the setting as a counter power to what's happening. Because implicit in the interaction is the hierarchy, is the notion that that's how these people behave. This is how we treat them.
It's not just in consumer settings. I mean, I remember going to a club night with a bunch of my friends, and it was two of us who were non-Black people of color and three Black people. So again, it's that like when it tips to like being a majority Black group, and then how the crowd is treating you. Yeah. I mean, one of my friends, men just kept groping her. And it was the hypersexualization and the over-sexualization of a Black woman's body and a Black woman's curves. Like, it was insane. And I got into more physical fights on this one night than I had in my entire life. This was many years ago. Statute of limitations. You can't get me on it. But it was so... again, you think you know racism. And then racism's like, I've got this whole other wardrobe. There's this whole other... dimension.
Which is why I actually find whiteness quite an interesting term, because obviously it's the idea that whiteness as a structure of power excludes people and sometimes includes them, right? So Irish people were gradually integrated into whiteness.
How the Irish Became White, great book.
Exactly right. So, I'd say that's happening to some extent to Polish people as well, although it still hasn't fully happened. I think Polish people are on the border of that, which is that there
Play your cards right.
Exactly right. Exactly right. But there's still, they retain it. There's something something in the power dynamic that retains a sense of like, yeah, but if we choose to, you're Eastern European scum and you can go back to where you came from. And we know it's there and we know it's latent. And so, but whiteness as an exclusionary mechanism excludes different peoples in different ways that are rooted in the history of white Europeans' interactions with those different groups. And so I think because of the history of slavery in particular, that the dehumanization that had to occur to justify what was done to Black people continues to bleed into the ways that many of us who are racialized as white may not even consciously recognize as being apparent. And so I say that in the sense that there are, of course, people who think of themselves as profoundly anti-racist and not racist who will replicate. And I wouldn't even say that I am not guilty of that myself, because I have blinkers. By virtue of my racial identity, I have blinkers.
I'm gonna do a poke. Do a little poke, all right? Which is, if the position is that even if you're an anti-racist white person, you're always going to be a bit racist on some level. And whiteness, which is this thing that, yes, it's socially constructed, but you can't change it about yourself. Is there not something politically disempowering about it? We're sort of saying to not just white people, but to everyone, that there is a resilience or an invulnerability to racism.
Until proven to the contrary, that is the truth. That racism is, well, do you have a society in mind where it's not the case that there is a structure of human value that places fairer skinned people at the top and darker skinned people at the bottom? Like, I don't have an example, sadly, so I have to deal with what I see. Everywhere I travel, from Malaysia to America to the Middle East, like, I, alhamdulillah, have traveled a lot in my life. In every single one of those settings, the people who are treated the worst are always Black.
So the first thing I'd say is that throughout other periods of human history, you have had systems of domination which is just not based on skin color at all.
Sure, I'm talking about, yes, contemporaneously.
Right? So the first thing I'd say is that, well, if we had to make racism, it also means that you can unmake racism as well.
Well, that's also a question. I think that's also a question. So can you, and we would explore this actually in the conversations I would have with some of these people, was, once you create these delineations, once you create these lines in the sand, and people also then start to build resistance to those lines in the sand in mirror of that, because, if you're being oppressed on the basis of being Black, then that becomes who you are, right? You don't accept what you're being told you are, but that's the category that you're now working within. It's, even down to the categories on our census. I mean, you can't, these categories are now there. Do we think that one day we're going to be able to like abolish them and say, no one is ever again going to think of people along these categorizations? I don't have an answer to that. All I'll say is I can't, my imagination is limited to be able to see how that would happen. I think what can happen is that the value and the hold of those categories can diminish. And I think that, to your question about it being disempowering, I actually don't agree. I think there's something empowering about recognizing where you stand within systems of power, because everything is power, everything is competing systems of power. And recognizing that not so much that it's immutable or personal, but that you are an active agent in either reproducing it or in contesting it.
So I agree. I think that latter point's really important, because I think that's the heart of all political agency, not just to do with anti-racism, but also to do with class politics, also to do with feminism, all of these other sort of, fronts in political struggle as well. But I think that, one, we have to acknowledge that the nature of racism in global North societies has changed. I think there is a difference between slavery existing as a legal codified structure and the basis of our economy, and us having a system of structural racism and imperialism and all the rest of it. I think that there is a difference. And
of course,
I think that it does a damage and a disservice to the political struggles that have came before, to sort of be like, what? Well, we still have racism. It's like, yes, but like to not have slavery, I think big deal. But second thing is that I think that Yeah, and there are interesting discussions around this, right? Spivak calls it operational essentialism, right? That we have these categories, we are forced to work within them operationally and strategically, but that doesn't mean that we have to treat them as real.
Good luck with that.
I mean, she there's a big old debate about like to what extent is it possible. You see a lot of essentialism, not a lot of operational.
There is a very strong trend in France of really racist white guys with black wives. And
sure, there's also trends of misogynists being married to women. I mean, sure.
Right. So there's, every category and permutation of, I'm on the scale of racist to anti-racist exists. And so does their kind of management of that identity within a culture that continuously tells us it's wrong. And I think that there has been the development, certainly, of this idea that if I marry, a person of color, that I'm somehow now absolved of my racism. That's
what I say all the time. I'm like, can't be racist against white people. Look.
Right. And I mean, to your point about the kind of negotiation of our identities as things that are either essential or instrumental, was that the word you were using?
Yeah, operational.
Operational or essential. I think that's particularly true for whiteness, because I definitely know whiteness is not an essential identity. Whiteness is a category that I exist in within this society, and I resist that. But I also benefit from it. So it's a really difficult one for me to say, oh, I'm kind of operationally, distant from it, when it's like, well, also I move through the world as a white woman who, if there's an issue and I scream, 10 people will come. Right? That like, it's just a reality. There's a different way that like I can try and distance myself ideologically from the category, but I move through the world in a way that category filters my experience and other people's experience of me.
Absolutely. And that's, I'm not a liberal, right? I'm not a
Me
liberal.
neither.
I'm not a liberal, so I don't, I agree with you that you can't just imagine yourself out of the category. But I suppose one of the things I'm really interested in, and a piece of political history I'm really interested in, is the Black Panthers and the Rainbow Coalition.
Yeah.
And the work that they did, not just with, Puerto Ricans, young poor white people from Appalachia, but also with the Viet Cong. There was some famous sort of summits between the Black Panthers and the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong said, you are Black Panthers, we are Yellow Panthers, and joined them in the burning of the draft cards. And I suppose when we're making this argument about show me a society where, dark-skinned people, Black people aren't, always at the bottom of it. Well, I'd also say, well, it depends on context, right? So there you're talking about a situation in the 60s and 70s during the Vietnam War where the blackness of the Black Panthers is what gives them a vantage point and forms the sort of the core of their anti-imperialism and their communism as well. But it would sort of be... It would be really alien, and to take what we do today, which would be to sort of say, okay, if we're going to stand in solidarity with you, the Vietnamese people who are currently being subject to American aggression and imperialism, you have to abjure yourselves of your anti-blackness first. Or you have to admit the anti-blackness in your society before we can get moving on this. That's kind of what we do today. That's not what they did back then. So the Americanness of being... sorry, just to interrupt, but the Americanness also wouldn't disappear from the equation.
Yeah, so there's many things there. One of it, obviously, is the replicating in the forms of social organization of the categories of oppression, right? So Black people with Black people, yellow people with yellow people, white people with white people, which I also observe in terms of our conversation just now about sort of the essentialism. Like once those categories are created, once they're the locus of your oppression, they then also become the category through which you resist or not. Open question. As a Muslim, I guess I'm a little bit suspicious of the notion of organization along racial lines, because to me, racial lines are aleatory in essence. And I'm much, I'm someone who believes in organization around ideals and principles and things that are at a sort of metaphysical or ideological level. I understand that race, having been politicized, translates into ideological positions, but the question of whether that should then be the basis for social organization, That's not for me to say as a white woman in the conversation. I will never answer that question.
Why
I will
not?
I will not. But I will say...
I want to draw white people on this shit more often. No, I do. I really do. Because I think part of it is I sometimes feel frustrated when I hear someone go, oh, but I don't want to step there because I'm a man or because I'm white or whatever. I'm like, okay, but then what's happened is that we have a political relationship, right? I would call it comradeship. We're comrades together in a struggle. And when you go, oh, but I can't go there, I feel that as an inhibiting force on a political discussion and relationship.
I guess what I'm saying is I can't tell people of color, and I wouldn't want to tell people of color how to organize against their own oppression. And I think that it would be misplaced of me because of my subjectivity to do that. However, when I'm speaking with my friends, do I say like, I get, because I have a lot of friends who I guess are invested in political blackness, and I'm very critical openly of black capitalism because that's a fairly easy shot for me to take. I just don't understand why you think you're going to be the exception to the rule. And I'm sad that you've drunk the Kool-Aid that makes you think
who wants to be the exception?
Many people. Our entire social media culture is based on the idea that you're going to be the billionaire, you're going to be the crypto king, you're going to be like, especially male culture online is really based on the idea. They play a lot on this kind of competitiveness that we have, that men have around, like we have it too, but you know, it's very much pushed as a male thing. Of like, you know, you're going to be the ones, you're going to go up at 4 a.m. and you're going to work until 3 a.m. and then you're going to like drink this protein smoothie and then you're going to go out there and you're going to get all these women and you're going to get this job.
It's the American psycho lifestyle.
It's an American psycho lifestyle, but it's now normalized as aspirational. And I think it's obviously been deliberately normalized as aspirational because when you start to see obviously the interconnectedness of the people who control our social media platforms with those in political power, there's definitely a kind of shared interest in driving this notion that that lifestyle is aspirational as opposed to, I don't know, do we need billionaires? Maybe we just need like all of us to have a little bit more money, maybe a little bit of land, you know, be able to afford a family. I sense that might make us all a little bit happier than just like a couple of you absolute dickheads, excuse me, becoming billionaires. But what do I know? But so to connect that back to what we were saying, I in my conversation with my friends on political blackness, and I've had many of these, if anyone wants to go back to these conversations, there's a conversation with one of my favorite is with someone who is a very good friend of mine called Bina Salami, who is a Finnish Nigerian philosopher. And she talked to me about the notion of blackness beyond the notion of blackness that evolved through slavery. The idea that there was a conception of blackness that existed in Africa before this, and that, you know, there is something in that idea of blackness as a form of political organization that united Africans beyond the boundaries and beyond tribes and beyond these boundaries that have been created, that is powerful. And that I'm much more, like, okay, that I could kind of hear that. The notion of political blackness where it's like the specific identity that's been foisted upon you in the context of racism in this country becomes the basis for organizing the resistance. I understand that is where we are. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me personally, because I like the idea of us saying, understanding what that category has created in terms of inequality, but in terms of how we resist that, I wonder whether there is an imaginary place beyond it where we all meet. And again, I'm being an idealist and I'm also not experiencing it firsthand. So it could well be disconnected from people's day-to-day realities. And that's an important caveat, is that I think there might be a space beyond that. And again, as a Muslim, I think there is a space beyond that because our faith is multi-ethnic, multiracial, and really what unifies us are a set of ideas about the world. And within a Muslim context, obviously there are replications of the hierarchies that exist within our society. But there is also very much a recognition that, a Black African scholar could be, one of the most esteemed intellectuals or references by virtue of his knowledge, or her knowledge, I should say. And so, yeah, I'm more so driven by the idea that our organization has to be rooted. And that's why I really actually enjoyed your critique of identity politics, because, I could never have made it publicly, because I don't think it's appropriate for me through my racial identity to be making that critique of identity politics. But I thought it was good that it was there, because it's something I felt for a long time, that in a space, if I express a critique of the way that we're organizing politically as people resisting a system of exploitation that benefits from racism, that critique can be undermined primarily through my racial identity. And similarly, that it would then constitute forms of organization that I would be excluded from on the basis of my racial identity, even if I share the ideological objectives of the organization.
Well, look, I think we have to we've got to wrap it up here, because otherwise this could go on forever. I think we should do a part 2 one day. I would love to do
I'd love to do a part 2.
I would love to do episode 2. Myriam François, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
Thanks for having me.